I still remember 8-year-old me at recess at Avocado Elementary School being introduced to a game that I still play. There we were, standing at the threshold, the mouth of a cave, and we faced 8 skeletons. Dungeons and Dragons. This is back, that would be about 1980, just as D&D was getting going and becoming quite popular, and it was catching on in many schools, and it was amazing. Here was a board game, which was really, as an 8-year-old, how I mostly played it, where we would be cooperative. Yes, there was the dungeon master, somebody that would roll for all of the attacks of the monsters and be the narrator through the modules, the story that we were acting out in. But the other people that were playing, we were all on the same team. And we would work together to overcome the obstacles, to solve the puzzles, and of course to beat a lot of monsters down and steal their loot. Good times, good times. And then a panic set in. A panic that I will say that without fear, hopefully, of contradiction, that even my mother began to ask questions about this game, because there began to be news stories of children going missing, playing D&D, that this was a demonic game, that this was a game that was teaching magic and sorcery to children, and many schools banned it outright from their entire campuses. It was fine to play all of the other violent games that we normally played. You could play Smear the Queer as long as you wanted, smashing people into the ground that were designated by that slur. And that was a perfectly fine game. You could play football, pick up games on our playground with no grass, where people would routinely end up in the nurse's office for various cuts, bruises, slashes, and the undiagnosed concussions. That was okay. But D&D, that was the devil's playground. That should not be allowed. Now, where did it get this reputation of having devils? Well, if you opened up the monster manual, the guidebook that actually says what's what in the world that you'll be struggling against, there is a whole chapter on devils and demons, who, by the way, according to D&D lore, are fighting against each other. Very interesting. If anybody wants to know more about that, I'll be happy to inform you. But you could open it up, and there on A, because it was alphabetized, you would find Asmodeus. And then you would find Beelzebub. And people were like, well, what are we teaching children about demons and devils for? We need to get this out of our children's hands, because clearly it is going to indoctrinate them into satanic rituals in which they will be abused and exploited, or they will become abusers and exploiters. Funny thing is, do you know where they got the names Asmodeus and Beelzebub from? Ashmadai, Baal-Zevuv. They're Hebrew words. These are found in Midrash and Talmudic passages. They are found in Kabbalistic texts, in a various attempt at reflections upon the other realms, if you will. Now, within rabbinic texts and Jewish texts, they have very different roles to play, and very different than as they are conceived when they are borrowed into Christian literature, where they are also found in Christian books. In fact, if you were to skip ahead a few pages, or a few months, depending upon how you look at it, you'll see that the granddaddy of them all even makes an appearance in Hanukkah's Haftorah, Ha-Satan, the accuser. Satan, for those of you who prefer the English pronunciation of his name. Now, were we pulling the Bible, were we pulling the Talmud, Midrash, that they probably would have been happy to pull from the shelves, but were we pulling Christian sources that mention these different people, these different entities? Of course not. And yet, the game where we actually were getting to fight against the minions of the many hells, that was a danger. That had to be removed. The game where you could actually play a person of faith, serving a God that championed the cause of light, of goodness, of truth, of justice, that could infect a young mind. This was not just about D&D, however. This was an entire time period that has become known as the Satanic Panic, because we love rhymes. And as much as we loved panicking at that moment, we love talking about the panicking afterwards, because it makes for good content. Does anybody here remember living through the Satanic Panic? Got a couple hands there. The rest of you, you just blocked out. You have repressed memories. You weren't old enough? Okay, well, I guess you weren't into D&D when I was, but I guess that's why I have more gray hair. The Satanic Panic was a period beginning in the 70s and moving on into the 80s that really sociologically we can see quite clearly as being a reactionary movement to all of the changes that were undergoing during the 60s and 70s. You know, freedom. And the Satanic Panic was basically built around the idea that there were satanic cults at work in the United States in large number. Child goes missing, abducted by Satanists. An animal is found dead, clearly part of ritual sacrifice. And there was a time when police departments across the country were expected to have training courses to prepare officers to recognize the signs of ritualistic behavior, ranging from blood sacrifices to signs on the walls and to other things even more gruesome. Literally, there are training videos from this time period so that police can recognize when they are dealing with the occult. The reason why it's called the Satanic Panic, however, is because there has never been any shred of evidence ever produced that anyone was actually involved in any of these satanic rituals. Whatever you may have heard about the police suspect that Satanists may be involved in the abduction of little Tommy so-and-so, that news story was never countered by the retraction that said, no, actually, it was his estranged father who abducted little Tommy, or it was the uncle, or it was the babysitter that had been warned about and had been passed from place to place because no one wanted to work with them because they were a problem. There were real threats to children, and there were real threats to adults, but they were the threats that are of the more mundane and non-demonic variety. They were the threats of abusive parents. They were the threats of children being exploited by those who would sexualize them. There were threats of people that would be in dire circumstance, disappearing from the community because they had to look elsewhere to survive, and they were not going to tell their neighbors why they had vanished so suddenly. But the Satanic Panic very neatly hid those problems. They very neatly explained every disappearance, every runaway, as though they were a victim of satanic cult behavior, rather than very often a child running away from a home where they found no love, they found no help, and they often found only hate and abuse. But the Satanic Panic meant that we didn't have to deal with those issues. We could instead search the forests for those that were involved in the occult. And we found them. That is to say, through repressed memory usage in court, much to the eternal shame of our legal system, we invented victims of these various things, and people were put away in jail, sometimes for decades, on false evidence and shoddy research and the testimony of experts that could tell you just exactly how satanic this suspect was. Why? Why would we do this? Why would we turn to these types of explanations? Well, fundamentally, because for many people this was the most comforting explanation for the change in the world that they saw around them. They saw people of different races mixing. They saw people choosing to move away from the values of their parents, values often that were steeped in bigotry and hate of many varieties. They saw people that were jumping ship out of communities that would not allow them to be themselves, to express themselves, to love whom they wish to love. And they said, this must be the devil's work. This must be Satan at play within our communities. What other explanation could there be? After all, I have beaten my child till they were black and blue, and yet they still refuse to be the person I want them to be. It must be a demonic presence within them, because certainly my child would have been disciplined by me by now. But why all of the occult and the idea of blood sacrifices and the issue of the vulnerability of the very little? Indeed, some of the most famous cases of the Satanic Panic dealt with daycare centers that came under suspicion by, panicked people. Well, because this is the pattern that plays out again and again and again through history. And we should know. Who was the victim of the very first blood libel that was leveled against the Jews?
I know it was in Norwich, England.
A little boy in Norwich, England, who has since become a saint for his martyrdom at the hands of the Jews. Did a Jew ever actually kill a little boy to gather their blood for their Passover matzah?
No.
Of course not. Of course not. But it sounds good, doesn't it? Doesn't that sound good? If you were suspecting that, these people who are not like us, who lack the sacraments that the Catholic Church was giving at that time, that they would need blood, because after all, we do. That is what communion is by definition. Would you not suspect them of finding a source? And would you not suspect them of finding a source among children? It's the perfect target, and the reason why it is used over and over again in scare tactics and panics throughout history. Because if we believe that our enemies are attacking the children, then we simultaneously make them into monsters, because only a monster would attack a child. Again, notwithstanding what we know many children are subjected to within their own homes, and those are the people who would not consider themselves monsters. But nonetheless, children as the victim, clearly they must be monsters, but also children as the victims means that our opponent is not too strong. Remember, this is the constant Schrodinger's cat of those that we wish to hate. They have to be powerful enough to harm us, powerful enough to have international organizations, to have agendas, to have whole programs that will topple all of society, but still so weak that all we have to do is hate them enough and then they'll be defeated. And it works fine if you pick children as the victim. The idea of Jews running through the forest, snatching Christian children to use for their sacrifices fits the bill perfectly, as do the later incarnations of that same idea, brought and then labeled upon to blacks and other people of color who were accused of also abducting and abusing children, or white women as a common topic, again, as a symbol of, well, they were weak and that's why they were victimized, because we don't want to make them our enemy too strong. We also know that gays, those that are trans, have been accused of exactly the same thing. There is nothing new under the sun, as Kohelet says. When a script works so well, why rewrite it? Simply scratch out the name Jew and substitute it for the newest enemy. And then we too can be defended against this insidious evil as D&D. The problem with the Satanic Panic wasn't just that people had different ideas about what sort of games kids can play. That's fine. I like role-playing games. If someone else thinks that they are too serious or mature for their child, that's fine. I would disagree, but that's the whole point. We can have those disagreements. I don't think that children should be playing games like football where they can get concussed. There are other types of games that involve a lot of running around, throwing, hand-eye coordination, team building, etc., that don't involve lasting brain injury. But we can have that debate as well. But the underlying issue here with the Satanic Panic, and then the gay panic, and the trans panic, is that the panic is the point, not the actual objective. It is to move people into a state of fear and frenzy so that they will take actions they would not normally take under more mundane circumstances. They will not accuse, pillory, and lynch, sometimes socially, but all too often in real terms, those that they suspect and fear. Because a population that is afraid is a population that is easily manipulated. A population that panics is a population that is easily controlled. A population at rest, a population that is calm, a population that is examining what can be done and should be done in every aspect of society, that's much harder to wrestle into a particular position. And it's much harder to convince them to do things that go against their fundamental nature of goodness. So it seems almost trivial, I know, to bring up playing D&D when I was 8 years old. But it's illustrative of a pattern that has been repeated throughout history, not only since the 80s. And it is a pattern that has continually needed us to stand against, not only to defend ourselves against the blood libels that have been scattered around throughout European history in particular, but to also recognize it when it is being used against others. We are all humans, and we should all recognize when one of us is in danger. We should all recognize when any of us are being pilloried in an attempt to create panic and fear. And we should all say, enough. This is not right. Stop panicking, and let's talk. Thankfully, to guide us in that talk, we have two wonderful representatives from Keshet that will lead us in a discussion during our Kiddush luncheon, which will be in the social hall immediately after our service. So even if you don't normally stick around because you have goodies at home that you are looking forward to, stick around a little bit longer. I can assure you that it will help you overcome any rising panic you may feel. Indeed, that's much of the point of Judaism, is to remove that sense of panic, to give us shalom, give us peace, and to give us purpose. Shabbat shalom and Chag Sameach.